after the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s and the 70s, Japan had rapidly begun to modernize its country, and along with that, its military. From Poland to the Far East, the Russian Empire, which in fact weren't modernizing at the same pace you would think of a Western power, were slowly getting themselves in a very problematic debt, which led to less support for national pride amongst the people in the country. And with the Trans-Siberian Railway, Tsar Nicholas was getting more and more ambitious about incorporating the province of Manchuria into his empire, a province which was also in the eyes of the Japanese. You see, the Japanese had been conquering more and more lands in the east, such as Taiwan, Korea, and a Manchurian province called Shandong, but due to international pressure, Japan was forced to let go of the province. After the Boxer Rebellion in the Qing Empire, the Russians had a lot of their soldiers protecting the railway connecting Port Arthur to the Trans-Siberian Railway. The Japanese got very worried about this, and talks began between the two nations with the intent of lowering the number of Russian troops present on the railroad. The Russians weren't taking the Japanese very serious, and very soon after dropped the conversating. The Tsar was sure that if war broke out between the two nations, the Russians would triumph over the small Japanese people. After all, they had 5 times as many troops as they had, so how couldn't they triumph? On the 8th of January 1904, the Japanese declared war on the Russians, but only after they attacked the resting Russian fleet at Port Arthur. The Tsar had realized how serious the Japanese took this fighting, and watched on as Port Arthur was now under siege from the Japanese, and dispatched his navy and his western forces to head towards Asia. And after an incident with the Royal Navy, the Russians mistook them for Japanese vessels in Europe. The British swiftly shut off access to the Suez Canal for the Russians, and forcing them to go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope. When the Russians finally arrived in Asia, they were in no shape to fight, and even with its superior numbers, they didn't stand a chance to the smaller Japanese navy, ending in a total annihilation of the Russian navy. The Russian relief force had made it all the way east by 1905, but it was way too late for them. Port Arthur had surrendered, and the Japanese were preparing to attack again, this time at the Battle of Mukden. The Japanese decisively defeated the Russians, even though they were outmanned and outgunned. This would go on to be the largest battle fought pre-World War I. Following an uprising in St. Petersburg and mutinying soldiers and sailors, the Russians were forced to sign a peace deal with the Japanese at the Treaty of Portsmouth on the 5th of September 1905, which saw the Russians handing over Port Arthur and South Sakhalin to the Japanese. The war showed that Japan was not a small, underdeveloped nation. It was a strong, fierce, and modern nation who, against all odds, defeated the Russians